Okay, diolch yn fawr. I'm extremely grateful to our next speaker for agreeing to join us today. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi. I hope I'm not betraying a confidence when I say that Dr. Williams told me that he's going to be outside his comfort zone coming here today. Now, as a polyglot, a former Cambridge University academic, former Archbishop of Wales, and the first person in modern times to become Archbishop of Canterbury from outside the Church of England, I'd imagine that Dr. Williams has quite a large comfort zone. So I think we should take that as a compliment. So Dr. Williams' latest role is as co-chair, along with Professor Laura McAllister, of the Independent Commission on the Constitution and the Future of Wales. And he is going to talk today about law and sovereignty, questions of definition. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Dylan. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, I think. I wasn't exaggerating when I said this is rather out of my comfort zone, and why exactly I should have been asked to address you isn't completely clear to me. However, it is an opportunity for me to think out loud for a few minutes about one of the issues that's been coming up fairly regularly in the work of our commission, to which Dylan referred. So, if you'll bear with me, I'll say a little bit about that commission and its work, and then move on to one specific aspect of that work which relates to the legal system, and see if I can think of any connections with the work that you're doing as we go on. And in advance, may I apologise profusely that I'm going to have to do what I very much dislike doing, and that is rushing in and out, because I have to be at another engagement almost immediately after this. So forgive me and bear with me. But it's very good to see you all in Cardiff. The commission you've heard about, of which I have the honour to be the co-chair, is the Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales. We've been charged by the Welsh Government to outline what sort of options there might be in the immediate future for developments in devolved government in Wales. And broadly speaking, where we've got to so far is the three rather obvious options. We can reinforce and enhance the existing devolution settlement. We can move explicitly towards a more federal model for the whole United Kingdom. We can consider political independence. When I say we can, I mean, of course, we can't. We being Wales in this instance, given that decisions are finally made here by Westminster. And so you can understand, perhaps, that as soon as we've begun to raise these questions, the issue arises of what exactly parliamentary sovereignty means in the United Kingdom as it currently exists, and how flexible that notion is. Hence my title, about questions of definition. One of the first questions we get asked in the work of the Commission quite often, usually by not entirely sympathetic observers, is about parliamentary sovereignty. At present, the devolution settlement is, so to speak, at the goodwill of the government in Westminster. The powers are devolved in the sense that they are delegated. Some powers are reserved and defined as such. Some are operationally devolved, but of course all of them capable of being reserved again or withdrawn, given that the Westminster Parliament remains the sovereign legislature of the United Kingdom as it stands. So the options we're outlining are, in a sense, I won't say fantasies, because they're not. They're all of them achievable in various ways, but they are, let's call them, thought experiments. What might it look like if rather more powers were devolved, and what should those powers be? How would the United Kingdom look if it were conceived more as a federal union than it is at present? And most radically, of course, what would be the implications, political, financial, and social, of total political independence, where the sovereignty question is most acute? Now, it's been said that Wales is a country known not only for rugby, cakes, coal mining, and choral singing, but also for political commissions. We've had quite a lot of them in recent years, and their effect has not always been dramatically visible. But one commission, which reported just a few years ago, which had particularly strong and particularly focused recommendations, was a commission chaired by Lord Thomas of Caerdydd, John Thomas, former Lord Chief Justice of the United Kingdom, and much more importantly, like myself, a native of Ystrad in the Swansea Valley. We grew up on opposite sides of the road in Ystrad, which I think must be probably a first in British history. An Archbishop and a Lord Chief Justice having their formative years in the same place. Lord Thomas's commission made a very powerful and very detailed case for the further devolution of the justice system in Wales. It did so on a variety of grounds. One was, very practically, that we were still lagging behind in the training and equipping of legal professionals fluent in the Welsh language. We were still lagging behind in the provisions made for the giving of evidence in Welsh in the courts. Similar questions. But behind that is a rather larger question, which I remember Lord Thomas flagging up very strongly for us when he spoke to our commission in one of our evidence sessions some months ago. Since devolution, there is a growing body of Welsh law. That is not only laws made in Westminster relevant to Wales, but the enactments of the Senedd here in Cardiff. How do we guarantee that in the future there will be an adequate professional background for lawyers functioning, legal professionals of all kinds functioning within Wales, given that this is a body of law advancing quite rapidly and still perhaps unrecognised by many legal professionals on the other side of the border as a coherent body of legislation. But behind that is a question which in some ways is even more interesting. In the 16th century, Wales was of course united with England politically. The old complex medieval scheme of the balance between the native princes and the marcher lords, the East India Company and the Rajas, as you might say, that was wiped away, and the legal systems of Wales and England were incorporated. Or at least so it seemed. In practice, a certain amount of legislation peculiar to Wales and a certain amount of provision in statute peculiar to Wales continued, but became much more marked in the 19th century. For a variety of reasons, by the last couple of decades of the 19th century, Wales had become a country far more self-conscious about its political, cultural, and linguistic identity. The nonconformist Protestant churches in Wales were strongly resisting the legal monopoly of the Church of England in Wales, the Anglican Church, my own church in Wales. The position of the language was being reinforced by the development of cultural festivals and cultural practices of all sorts, the beginnings of the National Eisteddfod of Wales, and the aspirations of many communities to a more legally secure educational system were becoming very much more marked. The combination of those aspirations and those marks of a newly sharpened sense of identity, effects of that can be seen in a number of pieces of legislation passed in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. For example, in 1889, the Welsh Intermediate Education Act, the first piece of British legislation which in effect legally mandated universal secondary education. And that is a direct result of pressure from aspiring communities in Wales. The regional variation of licensing laws for Wales, that is to say the closure of pubs on Sundays, was a result of something of the same aspirational, if faintly unrealistic, sense of national identity, which was being pushed by some religious groups at the time. But the point I want to make here is that passing legislation peculiar to Wales in this quite broad brush way in terms of education and other cultural practices amounted to a recognition in Westminster that Wales, whatever the strict constitutional position, Wales was a polity of some sort. That is, it was a national community which had some claim to define its own needs. And once you've granted that Wales is a polity of a real kind with a coherent agenda, then of course you have a little bit of a difficulty in going on taking it for granted indefinitely that the specific self-defined needs of that polity should be administered from Westminster. You might say that 19th century legislation has already sold the pass from the point of view of a very strong unitary view of sovereignty. And all of that was what was behind the suggestions of Lord Thomas's Commission for the devolution of the justice system, which would of course involve the devolution of probation services, the prison estate, and to a significant extent, legal training and qualification as well. This would bring Wales more into line with what is the case in Scotland, and even to a large extent in Northern Ireland. And we have in our commission more than once raised our eyebrows and sighed a little over the idea of Welsh exceptionalism. That's to say, what is taken for granted in Scotland and Northern Ireland is still something for which we have to argue in Wales. Wales is the outlier in constitutional terms. Lord Thomas noted that when his commission reported, there was something of a deafening silence from the political establishment in Westminster. And he has said with some force that he's still waiting for a detailed response to the criticisms he's made of the present workings of the system and to the specific suggestions made for the future. We are ourselves in the Commission attempting to get some clearer messages from Westminster and elsewhere about what the case is against Lord Thomas's proposals. But to speak of the Thomas Commission is really simply to note that part of the Commission's work inevitably brings us up against a certain view of sovereignty, what I would call a unified, even metaphysical account of parliamentary sovereignty. We've all heard in recent years quite a lot of discussion, not very well informed, about sovereignty. And of course, the familiar debates around Brexit brought that issue into focus for many people repeatedly. We were recovering our sovereignty by leaving the European Union, so we were repeatedly told. The problem is, I suspect, that there's a confusion in here somewhere, hence my title about questions of definition, a confusion over what we mean by sovereignty. And I speak here with great trepidation because I'm speaking to people who know what they would be talking about in a way that I don't. Let me suggest, at least, that there is a confusion between what you might call a pragmatic definition of sovereignty and an ideological one. A pragmatic definition of sovereignty is a fixed, indeed a statutory, agreement about where the final court of appeal lies. Who has the last word in a legal debate? And there's a somewhat more ideological view of sovereignty, which depends on the idea that, for these purposes, the United Kingdom is a self-defining entity in which political powers derive directly from a single source. That latter view has, of course, become harder and harder to defend in strict terms in the last few decades. Developments in international law, the development of the International Criminal Court, a whole range of highly complex international agreements to do not only with armed conflict, but also, for example, with the law of the seas. All of these things have required sovereign nations to bind themselves in more and more complex and more sophisticated ways to one another's concerns. Sovereignty as an absolute, as something which is simply a reflection of, you might say, the God-given integrity of a state. Sovereignty has become something much more to be negotiated in systems of realistic and mutually beneficial trade-offs. Within any such system or any part of such system, the need for clarity about where the final word lies is obvious. To say that for certain purposes it lies beyond one sovereign jurisdiction is not to subordinate the entire jurisdiction of one country to another or to some fancied international entity, a world government, simply to recognize that the only way of settling dispute in that kind of context is by mutual binding agreement between sovereign entities, which will of course qualify their sovereign liberty in certain ways. Now that, again I'm relying on some of the discussion with Lord Thomas, that has been around, as you can imagine, very strongly in our discussions within the Commission. And we know that when we report finally, all being well, in December of this year to the Welsh Government, and when our report, we hope, enters into the DNA of political discussion in Wales and more widely, and we do hope so, though we're not entirely holding our breath, when that happens, people will say, of course, there are issues here about sovereignty, and I think it behoves us in that context to be reasonably clear in what we write about the challenges we do and don't wish to put to the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament. We are, I think, taking for granted in a lot of what we write that the capacity for self-limiting ordinance from the Westminster Parliament is greater than so far has been taken for granted. And many people have suggested to us, including the present First Minister, that there are 2 or 3 fairly straightforward pieces of self-limiting enactment, which, if Westminster were to consider them, would entrench the devolved settlement very much more securely than is presently the case. That is to say, would make for us a settlement which did not simply depend on the goodwill of Westminster. And we would argue that on the basis, I think, that the history that I've outlined, not least in the late 19th century, does suggest Wales regards itself as a polity. That is, in some sense, a coherent regional community with sufficient social, legal, ethical and political consensus, not about particular issues, but about its own identity, to justify a high degree of operational independence statutorily guaranteed at the highest level by Westminster. Some people have said to us, we should be thinking in the work of the Commission about the possibility of a minimum set of recommendations. This would be the least that could be done to secure the settlement more firmly and more permanently. Whether we will phrase it in those terms, frankly, I don't know at the moment. I think we have to do a great deal of discerning and unpicking before we commit ourselves there. But it is fair to say that the way in which our discussions are going within the Commission is moving us towards a reasonably strong statement that the present settlement is unhelpfully insecure, insufficiently anchored statutorily, and most importantly, capable of being reinforced in a way which doesn't simply tear up the relationship of Westminster to Cardiff Bay, but which grants a great deal more to what I've called the recognition of the polity of Wales as Wales. Exactly how we unpick the identity of Wales as Wales is a very complex question, but it's not unique to Wales. Right across the world, I think there are instances of, inverted commas, national communities held together by a mixture of ethnic, linguistic, political and traditional factors. It's not that we are exceptional in that respect. but that will need more work. So, moving towards not a conclusion, but at least a breathing space. What I'm saying that I see emerging from the work of the Commission is a set of fresh legal enactments which will allow us to plan more securely for the future, to attend in a more granular way to the needs and concerns emerging from local communities in Wales, to be reasonably certain that the provision of education, health, welfare, benefits, the administration of the immigration system and the administration of the law, that all these within Wales have a degree of mutual coherence and integrity that will help the more efficient and frankly more cost-effective delivery of these things. I've said that Wales has commissions coming out of its collective ears, and so it has. And one of the challenges we've had is there anything different about this commission? Now, of course, once we've said, of course, it's much better than all the others, the more substantive answer is we have attempted from the word go to conduct grassroots consultations on all the major areas of social pressure and social stress that we have identified. We have commissioned primary new research on opinions and attitudes. We've also partnered with a wide range of local community organisations representing those whose voices are not normally heard in these discussions to find out where the pressure points are in the current settlement. And in our interim report, published just before last Christmas, we devoted a whole chapter to spelling out 10 areas where the present system was under pressure, which led us to the conclusion that the present system, unaddressed and unreformed, was not really sustainable or justifiable. So we have rolled the pitch a little for making some challenges to what seem to us lazy assumptions about sovereignty and the need to preserve a particular model of how Westminster relates to the rest of the UK. Just how far that goes remains to be seen. You will all know much better than I that the legislative patterns which we find in federal states are as diverse as the interior diversity of each state, or more so. That looking at federal systems from Germany to the United States to a number of other cases, we're looking at apples and oranges, extremely hard to compare. What it means to say the United Kingdom should be more federally organised is by no means clear. But we would like to see that discussion unfolding just a little. Just as we would like to see the possibility of confederal models explored a little bit further in relation to whatever degree of independence Wales might aspire to. At the root of our discussions is that paradox I began with. Westminster law has, since at least the 1880s, quite conspicuously believed it right to legislate for Wales as a unit and for the needs and aspirations of the Welsh people as a kind of political unit. If that's the case, then arguably the logical implication is that Westminster should think of a more systematic renunciation of certain of its powers to a representative Welsh body. We've seen that the Senedd already operates on that basis. But how far can that go without stronger, more robust self-limitation at Westminster? That's the question we want to put. So for the Commission, I suppose the two questions we have at the forefront of our minds are, very practically and within the fairly near future, what is possible in terms of the self-limiting decisions of Parliament under the present scheme? How far can a statutory entrenchment of devolution go beyond what we have? And at what point does that spill over into something much more like a federal arrangement? And of course, the subset of questions there is it possible to reimagine the United Kingdom itself in a more federal way? And does that mean simply recognising fuller powers for the national assemblies in Belfast or Edinburgh? Or, more radically, does it involve an exploration of some of the aspirations we've been hearing about for more regionalised government within England itself? How does Westminster sovereignty look against the pattern that many speak about of supermayoralties being one of the major elements in an administrative and legislative system within the future? We've spoken to Andy Burnham and one or two other people representing that world, and have heard some, I think, very striking and perhaps rather utopian aspirations about what might be possible in radically regionalising English government. And again, we want to ask, at what point does that become something more like federalism? But we're also aware that English regions seldom have quite the robust sense of a self-contained polity that we have in Wales. And one of the things we have to keep working at is what is the difference there. We're also conscious that a federal system with England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland is somewhat vulnerable to political developments in Edinburgh and Belfast, of which we're all very well aware. And the prospect of Wales being left alone with England is, with due respect to England, not necessarily one that enthuses the majority of the Welsh people. It has been compared unkindly to a married couple left alone when the children have gone off to university. But when we're talking about a partnership with a massive disproportion in population, resource, tax base and so forth, we clearly have a problem, and that is one of the things which makes the federal option a lot more complicated than we would like it to be. But I mention it simply as one of the things we continue to discuss. So our second fundamental question is, what view of sovereignty emerges as we think through these slightly more federalising options? How far can one go in thinking through the self-limitation of the sovereign parliament in Westminster without creating political panic on the subject? Is it possible to think of collaborative models of sovereignty, mutual definitions of where final authority lies, without a complete breaking up of the UK as such? And that, I think, requires a great deal of work on what sort of protocols about shared and negotiated authority emerge, what kinds of agreement about where appeal lies, and final appeal lies, issues on which we as a Commission have no expertise at all and no party prepositions, but which we think are worth feeding in to the wider discussion about the constitutional and political future of the United Kingdom. Thank you very much for your patience in listening to this survey of what we're up to, some of the questions which we're raising. I hope that it won't be either laughably naive or totally incomprehensible to this audience, and that it may suggest some points for discussion, and even occasionally for feeding back to colleagues in the next door offices in due course. But please wish us well with the Commission and watch this space. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Dr. Williams. Thank you all. I think it is time